Hello everyone, this is Roshan here. Very good morning. We will be starting the session in a few minutes. I just want to give all the attendees and the registrations a little more time so that they can join the session. So let's wait for a few more minutes before we kickstart today's session. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Roshan here, the presenter for today. We're just giving some time for rest of the registrants to join the session. We will start the session exactly at 11:05 a.m. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. We're just waiting for the other registrants to join this call. Let's give them another 3 minutes and then we should begin the session at 11:05. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Roshan speaking. We are just waiting for the remaining attendees to join the call. We shall start the session exactly at 11:05 a.m. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let's wait for 1 more minute for the remaining attendees to join the call, and we'll begin the session at 11:05 a.m. Okay, so let's get started. Before I begin the session, a quick introduction about myself. My name is Roshan. I work as an Azure Solution Architect with Ingram Micro Cloud Division. I'm based in Melbourne, but I work as a national role. So I cover Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and the other regions of Australia. Today's session is about Windows Virtual Desktop technical walkthrough. So today, most of the slides will be technical. You'll have very few marketing and sales oriented slides. My goal for today is to give you enough information to understand Windows Virtual Desktop and make a decision on which solution, which products to combine and deliver a Windows Virtual Desktop solution to your customer. At any point of time during the session, if you have any questions, technical or non-technical with respect to audio, feel free to put those questions in the chat. Any technical questions will be answered at the end of the session. Any non-technical questions would be addressed immediately. So let's get started. So a quick run through of the agenda. I'll quickly talk about the market potential for desktop as a service. Then I'll straight away jump into what is Microsoft Azure Windows Virtual Desktop. We'll run through a quick introduction. We'll look at high-level points. Then we'll compare how Windows Virtual Desktop is different with respect to deploying a remote desktop infrastructure on Azure. We'll also look at the logical architecture, the licensing, and the components that are involved in deploying a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. I also want to talk about a very special vendor that Ingram Micro has in its portfolio called as NoDo. And at the end, before we jump on the Q&A, I'll go through some of the customer scenarios and few pricing examples that'll give you a fair idea in terms of how much does a Windows Virtual Desktop cost for a typical infrastructure in an SMB market. So this is what I want to cover today, and then let's get started. Desktop as a service market is a very big market, especially in Australia. In the last 6 to 8 months, one of the highest requests that I've received from the partners and customers that I work is on remote desktop infrastructure on cloud. Gartner and IDC predict that it's over $3 billion of revenue by end of 2020. And there are a lot of customers thinking and moving to cloud-based or public cloud-based infrastructure to deploy their virtual desktop infrastructure and give a seamless experience to their employees who are sitting in the office or remotely working. It also has a huge market and dependency on infrastructure as a service. In the upcoming slides, you will see that most of the Windows Virtual Desktop components are actually core components of infrastructure as a service. So there is no doubt that in the coming months or even in the coming years, desktop as a service will be one of the biggest markets and one of the biggest revenue and profit generating markets in Australia and worldwide. So what is Windows Virtual Desktop? Microsoft announced Windows Virtual Desktop out of public preview sometime in the month of September 2019. It is the very first Windows 10 multi-session desktop as a service functionality available in the market. What does that mean? When an end user logs in to the virtual desktop, he gets a Windows 10 desktop, not a Windows server like you traditionally get when you deploy Microsoft RDS. It's a Windows 10, a fully fledged Windows 10 experience that an end user gets benefited with. It is optimized with Office 365 Pro Plus. Your OneDrive can be synced on your virtual desktop. You can configure your Outlook and of course the other components of Office products. One user will never see the data of the other user. January 14th, 2020 was the last date when Microsoft Windows 7 was officially supported. After that day, Windows 7 has stopped receiving critical security updates and patches. Now, if you have a customer who wants to continue to use Windows 7 due to application dependency, due to budget issues of not being able to upgrade, And if he wants to still continue to receive security updates and patches, then he has to deploy Windows 7 on a Windows virtual desktop infrastructure and use it, because only on Microsoft Azure Windows Virtual Desktop will he receive Windows 7 updates for the next 3 years. If he doesn't do, and if he continues to use Windows 7 on his local laptops and desktops, then he's at a risk of being attacked or hacked by hackers. Windows Virtual Desktop is also very tightly integrated with Microsoft 365, especially with respect to security. Things such as multi-factor authentication, conditional access, auditing of user logins, all these are very well integrated, and the base of this integration is Microsoft 365. It offers both pooled and personal desktop. Pooled desktops means a single infrastructure from which multiple desktops are created. You can think of it as a single server within which multiple virtual machines get created, and each virtual machine is assigned to a user. Personal desktop means a dedicated resource is assigned to the user. So you can think of a dedicated server or a dedicated virtual machine, which is not shared with anybody else, is assigned to the user. So you can have a combination of both pooled and personal, or you can just have pooled or just have personal as well. Windows Virtual Desktop makes it very, very easy to deploy a VDI infrastructure. In the upcoming slides, you will see how easy and simple Microsoft has made this offering to its customers and partners. A quick comparison between Windows Virtual Desktop and remote desktop infrastructure or remote desktop server or terminal server on Azure. Both of them definitely use the core components, compute, storage, and networking. You definitely need virtual machines, you definitely need storage onto which you will store the data, and you definitely need networking, whether it is communication between the virtual machines itself, or if it is communication between your on-premise network and Azure network. So when you deploy Windows Virtual Desktop or RDS, you end up using the same amount of, I wouldn't say same amount, but the same type of infrastructure. Now coming to the control panel, Windows Virtual Desktop control panel is managed and maintained by Microsoft. There is no virtual machines to be deployed, just for the management layer of Windows Virtual Desktop Management Service. And since you're not deploying any machines just for the control panel or the management layer, you of course don't need to worry about the licensing for it. When it comes to a remote desktop server, you definitely need to deploy several roles in order to go ahead and create the management layer for remote desktop server or remote desktop infrastructure. So this is, though is hosted on Azure, you still need to manage it. Things such as licensing server, gateway server, web server, all these things have to be created, managed by the customer or the partner who's running it on Azure. You definitely need virtual machines to deploy these roles. You need Windows Server operating systems for it. And since you're using virtual machines with Windows Server, you also need to license these Windows servers as well. Coming to the Microsoft licensing aspect, again, a quick comparison between Windows Virtual Desktop and RDS. With Windows Virtual Desktop, all you need to worry is about the Windows 10 licenses. How do I get the Windows 10 license? If your customer is using any of the Microsoft 365 plans mentioned here, which is E3, E5, A3, A5, or even business, then he is covered for the Windows 10 license, which means if he is using M365, then Windows Virtual Desktop is a potential upsell that you can go ahead and offer to your customer, because he already has a piece of license with him which he can reuse for Windows Virtual Desktop. The same holds true if he has a Windows 10 subscription. So Windows 10 subscription is again available under Windows 10 E3, E5, A3, A5, or business. Or if there is a customer who separately purchased a Windows 10 Enterprise VDA license. So if you have a customer who's using any of these three sections of licenses, then he's already eligible to use Windows Virtual Desktop, or he can actually reuse these licenses with Windows Virtual Desktop. When it comes to remote desktop infrastructure, you definitely need RDS CALs. You need server operating system. Now, whether you purchase under volume license or server subscription, you definitely need those. And whether you purchase under software assurance or not is an option that you have, but you definitely need a server operating system license and RDS CALs. Now, these two are not required when it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop or Windows 10 multi-session infrastructure. So that's a quick comparison of what's the difference between Windows Virtual Desktop and RDS. I do not want to go into too many details. Hope this gives you a fair understanding of where Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure stands out and how is it different than an RDS deployment on Azure. So let's look at the logical architecture of Windows Virtual Desktop. So you have the clients. Microsoft has released a special RDP client for remote desktop infrastructure, which the end users would use. If they do not want to use the RDP client, for example, let's say they have dummy workstations, right, with just a browser in it, then it is also available, or you can also use any HTML5 browser. It also has native apps on Android, iOS, and Windows platform. So if your customers are into iPads and um, uh, Android books, then they can definitely go ahead and download the app, the Windows Virtual Desktop app, and continue to use or access Windows Virtual Desktop from these platforms as well. As you can see, the section in the middle, which is the web access, the diagnostic server, gateway, session broker, and even the licensing server, all these are managed and maintained by Microsoft, which means when you deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop tenant, you do not deploy any of these roles. You can think of it in this way. Microsoft has already deployed these roles and made them available under platform as a service model. So you don't need to worry about its scalability, its availability, its reliability. It's always up and running. It is managed and maintained by Microsoft. All you need to worry and plan is how many desktops do I need? What type of desktops? Do I need pool desktops or personal desktops? Am I deploying additional infrastructure apart from Windows Virtual Desktop? For example, do I need an additional SQL server? Do I need an additional Linux server to run my application on Azure? And what type of Active Directory infrastructure would I deploy? So these are some of 3 to 4 questions that you need to get answers from your customer in order to plan and deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. A quick summary of the licensing again. Customers who are eligible to access Windows 10 multi-user, multi-session have the licenses that are required to use and run Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, Windows Virtual Desktop can also give you a server operating system as the login OS if your customer is still interested for several reasons. If he still wants to continue to use a Windows Server as the operating system, then he definitely needs RDS CALs with software assurance. He cannot use existing RDS CAL without software assurance with Windows Virtual Desktop. He has to purchase, or he has to have an active software assurance in order to use a server workload or a server operating system as a login instead of Windows 10 on Windows Virtual Desktop. So we have looked at the licensing aspect. We have looked at the differences between Windows Virtual Desktop and remote desktop infrastructure. We also looked at the logical architecture of Windows Virtual Desktop. Now let's quickly dive into What are the various components that actually go into deploying a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure? You definitely need an active Azure subscription because Windows Virtual Desktop is a service available inside Azure, so it's a no-brainer. You definitely need an Azure Active Directory tenant. Now, if you have deployed a Microsoft 365 or Office 365, you would already have an Active Directory infrastructure. So I will talk more about what type of Active Directory infrastructure you need, what are the options in the upcoming slides. You definitely need storage for user profile containers. Now, what is this user profile container? User profile container is a replacement for user profile disks. If you remember, and if you have deployed RDS on-prem or on Azure, you would know that user profile disk is the disk in which your user profile data, your C/user or system drive/users container or the data is stored in. In Windows Virtual Desktop terminology, we call them user profile containers. So you definitely need to plan for storage of these user profile containers. You definitely would require an Azure virtual network. You would definitely require virtual machines, and VPN is optional if you would like to connect your Windows Virtual Desktop network and infrastructure with on-prem or another location on Azure. So in the upcoming slides, let's deep dive into what gets deployed in your Azure subscription with respect to Windows Virtual Desktop, what options are there for Active Directory infrastructure, and what are my storage options for user profile containers. So the first one is Azure subscription. So when you deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop service, or when you create the 10 the host pool for Windows Virtual Desktop, it actually goes ahead and registers your subscription for Windows Virtual Desktop. Once your subscription is registered, then you have the option to go ahead and create host pool. Host pool is you can think of it as a logical container within which you create session host, and session host is nothing but Windows 10 infrastructure into which the user log in. So you first register your Azure subscription for using Windows Virtual Desktop, and then you get the option of creating host pool. You can definitely create multiple host pool. For example, you can create a host pool for personal desktops. You can create another host pool for pooled desktop. You can create the third host pool just for app publishing, right? Windows Virtual Desktop is not just VDI, it is both remote app and VDI infrastructure. So we do have customers who have separated these host pools into, let's say, desktop and apps, or they have even gone to an extent where they have done pool desktop, personal desktop, and app applications as three different host pools. And of course, you can manage and maintain all of these. Now, what goes inside a session host? So session host is nothing but your Windows 10 multi-session OS, which is installed, which eventually multiple users would log into and do their day-to-day activities. One of the very important points when it comes to networking, and this is one of the frequently asked questions that I get, is with respect to security, because when you deploy RDS, you need to open an inbound traffic port in order to access your VDI infrastructure. With Windows Virtual Desktop, you do not need to do this. Windows Virtual Desktop actually deploys an agent on each host pool and uses technology called as reverse connect to establish a connectivity without opening any inbound ports. And all this is done automatically. You don't need to configure these nitty-gritty details of port and creating the reverse connection. It is all done by default by Azure when you actually go ahead and deploy a session host within Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. Now, there are two links that I've specified at the bottom of the slide. The slides will be shared post the session when you receive the recording. I quickly wanted to show these two links. One is a Windows Virtual Desktop Assessment. It actually tells you how far is the service available within your region, which means it actually gives you the latency information. And I keep receiving questions regarding, is Windows Virtual Desktop actually available within Australian region? Initially, when it was announced in September 2019, it was not. But by the end of December 2019, it was actually made available within Australian regions as well. So I want to quickly show these two links so that you have complete information about it. So the first link is the virtual desktop assessment. It's also called as Windows Virtual Desktop Experience Estimator. So as soon as you open this link, you will see the round trip time to live values, and it also shows which is the closest data center for you. Now I'm using a VPN to deliver this session, so it has given me an IP address of somewhere close to India. So hence it shows the Indian region and location. But when you go ahead and open this tool, you should see either Australia East or Australia Southeast as one of your closest data centers. It is definitely available within the Australian region. The reason I say that is using the second link. So this is product available by region. And if you see, Windows Virtual Desktop is available, and it is not region specific. It is actually available across Australia, across all the data centers, including the central, which is hosted in Canberra, and also across Germany. I've just selected two different regions for you to show that it's non-regional. It is available in every region where Microsoft has its data center. So going on to the next component, which is Active Directory. This is a very important component, especially as we need to plan for this particular service before actually deploying a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. Now, Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure has to run in a domain joined scenario. It cannot be installed, configured, or even used in a workstation model, which means that you need to have an Active Directory infrastructure within which you deploy Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. Now, within Azure, we all know Azure provides Azure Active Directory. It is the backbone for your Office 365 M365, where your users get created. But by just having Azure Active Directory, you cannot deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. You either need to have an Active Directory domain services, which means you need to have a virtual machine in Azure running the traditional Active Directory, the Windows Active Directory, or you need to have an Azure Active Directory domain services enabled within your Azure. Only when you have one of these two up and running within your Azure infrastructure, you can deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. So just to summarize, just the plain and simple Azure Active Directory, which you get with Office 365, M365, cannot be directly used with Azure to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. You can go ahead and enable domain services on the Active Directory. This is a service that has to be enabled. It doesn't get enabled by default. Once you enable, it gives you the option to join machines to the domain, right? So that is what Azure Active Directory domain services does. Now, there are differences between Active Directory, the traditional Windows Active Directory, and the domain services. I do not want to dive into too many details, but just to summarize it, Azure Windows Active Directory is your traditional Active Directory. You use users and groups, sites, and services to manage and maintain your users and groups and other devices. Domain services is the hosted model of Windows Active Directory, right? So in terms of limitations, you might see a few limitations when it comes to group policies or complex group policies with respect to domain services, but you will not see any of those limitations when you run Windows Active Directory on a VM, because it's a fully fledged Active Directory running on a Windows operating system. So you need to either have Windows Active Directory or have Azure Active Directory domain services in order to use Windows Virtual Desktop. Coming to the storage options for user profile container. Now, before I go into the storage options, I quickly want to take a step back and talk about where did this user profile container concept come into place. Microsoft, a couple of years ago, acquired a company called as FS Logic. FS Logic is a company that pioneered in delivering user profile data in containerized model. So what exactly happens in the backend? This is a complete explanation of what actually happens in the backend. The end user doesn't even notice these things happening when he logs into. So in the backend, when a user logs into Windows Virtual Desktop, his user profile data is stored outside the Windows Virtual Desktop server or the session host, right? When he logs in, it automatically attaches this container to the Windows Virtual Desktop session host. And for a user, it just seems that his profile data was always available on that server. So think of it as a roaming profile, right? So it's a roaming profile concept, but it is containerized, and this data, the user profile container data, is stored outside the session host, outside the Windows Virtual Desktop server in a shared location, right? Now, what are my shared location options where I can store this user profile container data? So we have four options. You can definitely use a file server running on a virtual machine like a Windows server. This gives decent performance, but you definitely need to make sure that you have a backup strategy or you have redundancy for this file server, because all your user profile data is being stored on a virtual machine. I do have customers using it because for them it's just simple and easy to use and manage, because they are very well used to a Windows server based file server and accessing files, and you can just log onto the server, use a Windows Explorer format to manage and use it. You can also use Azure Blob Storage. Now, this definitely gives you good performance, minimal infrastructure, but if you tend to use premium storage accounts like SSDs, then you need to make sure you also consider a little extra charge on the storage operations or the storage transactions, because that gets charged in your overall utilization. You can also use Azure File Storage. Now, if you have been using Azure for some time, you know that there are different types of storages. There is disk, there is blob, there is files, there is queues. All these are different types of storages. Azure File Storage is an SMB protocol enabled storage, which means it is similar to saying I have a file server as a service, right? That can also be used with Azure Windows Virtual Desktop to store your user profile container. And the last one is Azure NetApp Files. Now, this is a native Azure offering that actually uses the NetApp storage technology in the backend. So, for example, if your customers are already using NetApp on-prem, then this becomes a really good use case for them to move their RDS, which is currently running on-prem on a NetApp storage, onto Windows Virtual Desktop and use Azure NetApp Files. They'll get the same performance, the same deduplication, the same latency. So it is primarily used by enterprise customers. Let's say if you're running SAP and trying to access it over Windows Virtual Desktop, then Azure NetApp Files would probably be the best storage solution for you to use. So you have four options available to use as a storage or a shared location to store your user profile containers. And this you can pick and choose for your Windows Virtual Desktop. You can select either a virtual machine, a file server as a service, or a blob or a NetApp storage. One of the recent announcements, this announcement was probably done, I think, a week ago, was Microsoft has invested in getting a feature where you can have your Azure File SMB Access Storage now being authenticated by the traditional Active Directory. It is not Azure Active Directory, it is just Active Directory. Right now, what do I mean by this is you can use the Windows Active Directory NTFS permissions on Azure files storage. Earlier, if you had to provide NTFS permissions on Azure file storage, you had to use Azure Active Directory domain services, right? Now that domain services is not required. So you can think of the scenario where you have deployed a virtual machine of Active Directory. You want to use Azure file storage for your storage option for your user profile container, and you want to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. So now you're getting best of all the worlds within your Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. This is currently in public preview, so please do be aware that it is not supposed to be used in production, but I highly recommend everybody to go ahead and try this. If you do not have quick plans of deploying Windows Virtual Desktop, this is a very good option if you have your customer using file server and they're looking to move their file server onto Azure. Right? Earlier, if you had to do this, then you had to enable Azure Active Directory domain services and then provide NTFS permissions. But now, with the simple, straightforward Active Directory, Windows Active Directory, you can use Azure File Storage. So a really good option for file server. And of course, the whole story of Windows Virtual Desktop fits into it very well. So we looked at the components in details, we looked at the licensing. Now let's get into the deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop. So Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure, if you use out-of-the-box options within Azure, then you have to, of course, set up the Active Directory infrastructure, either Windows Active Directory or domain services. Give consent. Give consent is nothing but the registration process, and then you start going ahead and creating the tenant and creating the host and session host and assigning permissions. The blocks which are marked in gray, these are blocks or these are sections that you have to do using PowerShell. As of today, Microsoft doesn't have the option to do these using user interface. Of course, Microsoft is in the process of developing user interface and giving a much better experience to the administrators and the management people on managing Windows Virtual Desktop. But as of today, there are steps that are involved in the deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop where you have to use PowerShell scripts. So it's about eight to nine steps that you have to go through in order to deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. First time it may not be very easy. As you start doing it regularly, you'll find it more easy and faster. Now, Windows Virtual Desktop is one of the biggest requests that I get for the last, I think, 3 to 4 months. So what Ingram has done is we looked into the market and we wanted a solution which we can give it to partners. This solution is not for customers. This is actually for partners where they not only manage and deploy and automate the deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop, but they are also able to manage multiple Azure infrastructure with or without Windows Virtual Desktop and give a very good service to their customers. So we wanted to introduce Azure in an MSP model to our partners, and that is where we onboarded a new vendor called NoDo. NoDo is one of those platforms which makes your deployment of Azure very, very simple and easy. It helps you manage multiple customers from a single pane of glass. Now, whether these customers are just using Azure or using Azure with Windows Virtual Desktop, or they're using just virtual machines, you can still manage and maintain all these customers. So it's actually a management and an orchestration layer that runs on top of Azure. What benefit does it provide? It actually goes ahead and gives you benefits such as easy deployment, automated deployment, especially for Windows Virtual Desktop. For example, it has a separate module within it for Windows Virtual Desktop. It gives you very good options in order to manage your golden image. I'm sure most of you have deployed RDS previously in your roles. If you need to update your base image or the golden image with updates and patches or new applications, Within Windows Virtual Desktop, it's not a very straightforward process. You have to use PowerShell scripts and commands to do that. But within NoDo, it's simple and straightforward. There are all the options are user interface based. You even get really good monitoring of these resources as well. So it helps you package your solutions. You can even package and price them. For example, you can say, I would want to give Windows Virtual Desktop for 15 users with some best practices at a certain cost, and I want to give pooled, personal, and combination of let's say graphics enabled desktop at a certain price. So it actually helps you price and package your offerings to your customers as well, and your customers can just select the offering, hit deploy, and you will get the notification. You can go ahead and deploy the solution for them. So it's a very interesting vendor that we have. It's already available on Ingram Micro Marketplace. If you do have access to it, go ahead and try it out. NoDo starts with $0 as a cost, like Azure. Only when you deploy a virtual machine or when you deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop tenant with it, that is when it starts charging you. So just to go ahead, play around on the interface, look at all the options. They have a very detailed website as well. Their website is getnodio.com, where you'll get all the information about their product and its module for Windows Virtual Desktop. So we looked at how to deploy using a vendor like NoDo and using the native Windows Virtual Desktop within Azure. But if you have a customer who wants to migrate his existing on-prem RDS infrastructure onto Azure, what options do we have? Sorry. Microsoft has introduced Azure Migrate as a service. Now, this is a dedicated, I would say, section or a service within the Azure portfolio that is used to migrate anything which is on-prem. It can be your applications, file servers, Windows workloads, Linux workloads onto Azure. Now, Azure Migrate doesn't have a very specific service for VDI or for Windows Virtual Desktop, but having said that, it does provide us with several tools which we could use in order to make our migration much more easy. It does assessment of existing infrastructure. So if you want to know how big is your user profile disk, how many users, concurrency, peak latency, all these information, it will definitely help you do that. It does a very good lift and shift migration of your existing infrastructure onto Azure, and it actually has a very interesting ISV integration. There is an ISV called Lakeside. They have integrated their designing and monitoring of remote desktop infrastructure tool onto Azure Migrate. This service is available as of today in all the regions where Azure is available. You can use this tool from this ISV to create a beautiful report of your existing infrastructure. What are the resources would you require for this on Azure? How do you migrate? What is the sizing and costing? So all these features and functionalities is available within Microsoft Azure Migrate, which you could use for your VDI infrastructure migration as well, your existing on-prem VDI infrastructure to Azure. So what are the typical use cases? I'm sure most of you already know about this. Well, I'll tell you what are the highest inquiries that I've been getting. One is definitely BYOD. There are a lot of customers who use, who work remotely, who may or may not have really good infrastructure facility, but they still want to access a good infrastructure with Windows 10, and the IT wants to manage and maintain. That is a classic use case that I've been receiving for Windows Virtual Desktop. I've been receiving a lot of use cases with respect to design and engineering industry, especially where customers tend to use applications such as Revit, AutoCAD, Autodesk, or even Adobe softwares for editing of images and photos. They want to move away from buying expensive laptops, which probably cost $5,000-$6,000 with graphics card, and they're looking at options where they can use Windows Virtual Desktop, especially when they hire contract designers or contract employees who work with them for 3 to 6 months, right? So these are some of the use cases. The other use case that I've been getting a lot is in healthcare. where doctors would want to access a Windows 10 platform and then access their applications through them to store and update medical or patient information. So these are some of the inquiries that I receive on everyday basis. But having said that, Windows Virtual Desktop provides you a very secure infrastructure and is very scalable to several industries as well. So before we summarize, I quickly wanted to go through some of the customer scenarios and give you some simple pricing options so that you have a fair idea of how much does it actually cost. It has good features, good functionality. It is simple to deploy. You even have a tool now to deploy it. So let's look at some pricing options. So considering a very simple scenario where you have 15 users, end users in a customer company, they are already using Microsoft 365 Business, and they're basically looking to move their on-prem RDS infrastructure onto Azure, right? So in this scenario, if you move them to Windows Virtual Desktop, it will cost them approximately about $36 per user per month. Now, in this $36, what is involved? Of course, Windows 10 license is covered. You deploy an Active Directory and a file server virtual machine, so the uptime and running of these virtual machines is covered. Backup of Windows Virtual Desktop and Active Directory and file server is covered. And you also have VPN cost covered in this price. So all this, the backup of the entire infrastructure, VPN, and they're using pool desktops, which means all the 15 users are getting resources from a big fat Windows session host server in the backend. So this is a quick example for a small company. Similarly, let's add few more things if you have another slightly bigger customer. Let's say you have a customer with 30 users, they're using Microsoft 365 Business. Now, in this scenario, the customer wants to have dedicated resources for their management, let's say the CEO and the CFO. So they need 2 dedicated desktops or dedicated infrastructure. And they want to move their Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure to Azure with the SQL Server that they're using. We are assuming that they're using an in-house application. It can be accounting software, management software, attendance system. So they want to move the SQL Server also onto Azure. So the cost comes up to roughly about $66 per user per month. Now this includes Active Directory, file server, and SQL Server virtual machine. Uptime of all these, backup of all these virtual machines, plus the Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure backup. So the Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure includes 4 pool desktops and 2 dedicated desktops. I have mentioned the specs of them, and it includes site-to-site VPN. Right. The last scenario, let's say you have a company of 35 users using Microsoft 365 E3 plan. Let's say this customer is into graphics designing and they work with machineries and product design development. So they definitely need certain graphics enabled desktops. They also are very interested to move their RDS infrastructure onto Azure with SQL Server that they have, and they want to enable 3 years reserved instance. So they know that they would be using more virtual machines, so they want to enable and take the benefit of reserved instance. So by combining all this, the cost again is roughly about $66 per user per month. It includes all the virtual machines. It includes NV6. NV6 is actually, if I'm not wrong, a 6-core 56 GB RAM virtual machine, which has graphics card in it. So they get a GPU-enabled graphics card. They get pooled and dedicated desktops, backup, and VPN. So I hope this gives a fair idea in terms of pricing and costing. But having said that, each customer scenario is different. You can always get in touch with me, and I will help you out defining a costing strategy for your customer that fits his budget and also delivers the product and services that he is looking for. Some of the upcoming features that you can expect for Windows Virtual Desktop in the next coming months: MSI App Attach. So MSI App Attach is a new technology that Microsoft is working. This is, again, they inherited this from FS Logic acquisition, where instead of deploying applications on another virtual machine, you can deploy it within Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure using the app attached model. So this makes it much more easier and cost effective and much more simpler in order to access client server based applications within Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. Microsoft is also working really hard to bring in Microsoft Teams integration. So if you just do a YouTube search on Microsoft Teams on Windows Virtual Desktop, you will see one of the product managers talking about it, where they are trying to bring in the audio video conferencing system within the VDI infrastructure, right? A very interesting option. We have already talked about Active Directory authentication with Azure Files. That now allows you to use traditional Windows Active Directory with Azure File Storage for authentication. Microsoft is also currently in public preview to convert your user profile disks to user profile containers. This will make your migration path much more simpler and easier, so that when you move your on-prem RDS infrastructure to Azure, you are not only moving the servers, you have the option to convert on the fly the user profile disk to containers. And the last option is universal print. The universal print was just announced a couple of hours ago by Microsoft. This is especially for customers who are into printing industry. Earlier, if you had to use on-prem printers with your Azure infrastructure, you had to have a hybrid setup like a site-to-site VPN. Now, Microsoft is investing where you do not need to set up this hybrid infrastructure. You can go ahead and register your printers on Azure Active Directory itself, which makes it much more easier and simpler to manage printers, and also improves the end user experience. The current promo that Ingram Micro is running, if you onboard new customers onto Azure between February 5th and March 31st, and if they consume $500, then you get $250 as cashback. If you need more information about this, please get in touch with us. You can get in touch with your account manager or cloud business development managers. We are more than happy to entitle you with this offering for any new customers that you onboard between this time frame. So a quick summary. Upsell Windows Virtual Desktop to your M365 or Office 365 customers. Now, do remember that if your customer is only using Office 365, then he is not eligible for the Windows 10 license. So he has to use M365. So it's a potential opportunity to move customer from Office 365 to M365 and then to Windows Virtual Desktop. Customers with Microsoft 365 can already use Windows 10 licenses. Migrate your existing RDS or terminal server customers to Windows Virtual Desktop. Replace expensive laptops, especially graphics enabled laptops, with Windows Virtual Desktop, and start building your own MSP model to deliver desktop as a service functionality with NoDo. With this, I come to the end of the session. I'll now go ahead and look into the questions that I have received on the Q&A. I will be available on the chat for the next 7 to 8 minutes. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can always drop me an email. My email address is listed on the screen. So feel free to drop me an email if you have a big scenario that you want to have a chat. We can always schedule a call and take it up offline as well. But having said that, I am available on the chat for the next 5 to 8 minutes. Feel free to post your questions on the chat, and I'll be more than happy to go ahead and answer them for you.
Sean, there was only one question. If this session will be shared. So I just replied to everyone in the chat box to let them know that we will be sharing the slides and the recording of the webinar as well.
Okay, well, wonderful.
Wait, there's lots of questions coming in now. Sorry. So we have another question. User profile containers still VHDX?
I do see some questions here. Can you recap the small business scenario? Slides read $63, but verbally You said 36. I'm sorry if I said $36. It is $63. Bradley, I hope that answers your question. Good information. Thank you very much, Andrew. In the first slide, it was what you said, 36. I'm very sorry. It is $63. I'm really sorry for telling it $36. It is $63. How does NoDo work? Do they build solution based on your request? I wouldn't say NoDo builds solution based on your request, Mr. Thomas. NoDo is a vendor. They have built already a solution that works on top of Azure, which can manage your entire Azure infrastructure. When I say manage it, you can deploy virtual machines, you can deploy applications, you can deploy Windows Virtual Desktop as well via NoDo tools or the NoDo options, which are available through their control panel. Right, so it's a tool that works on top of Azure, and what makes it so special and easy is it is one of those tools that will help you manage multiple Azure subscriptions from a single pane of glass. So you can quickly monitor their consumption, look at what they're using at any point of time, and you can deploy. They have a dedicated module for Windows Virtual Desktop. So you can, instead of running the 8 to 9 steps that you have within Azure, with a couple of clicks, you can actually automate the entire deployment. And you can also create pricing packages. So you can say, you can already create packages such as, I don't know, package 1, package 2, package 3, and your customer can actually select that package and let you know, and you can deploy the entire package for your customer, right? That can include different configurations of Windows Virtual Desktop with Office 365, without Office 365, with M365, with a virtual machine, additional virtual machine, things like this, right? So it's a very beautiful product. We are happy to have them as part of our portfolio. If you do have any specific questions, feel free to drop me an email, and I'll be more than happy to probably have a session just covering the NoDo options, the NoDo tools and technology for you. If Windows Virtual Desktop uses SharePoint or OneDrive, how quick is it to access files in an online mode, or is it worth doing a local sync? Good question, John. When you use OneDrive especially, or even SharePoint document sync, the access is very, very fast because it is all Windows Virtual Desktop is running in Azure. Office 365 is also running on the same cloud infrastructure. So they're more or less part of the same infrastructure in the backend. So the access is very fast, very seamless. You can either use online or offline mode, and it is as similar as syncing it, syncing a file server to your local desktop, right? So it's pretty seamless, very straightforward, and the end user experience is much improved when you compare it with syncing from Office 365 to your local laptop on your LAN. Right? So it's definitely much faster and much better. Can NoDo be used with existing Azure deployments? Mark, the answer is yes. They do have options where you can import your existing Azure infrastructure within their control panel or within their management console and continue to manage them. So NoDo definitely helps you for new deployments, but if you already have, whether it is Azure components or Windows Virtual Desktop components, you can definitely import them and manage them. Hi Roshan, I've deployed Windows Virtual Desktop, but I have not applied M365 license. Currently using, I'm not sure how is it working. Okay. Again, if you deploy Windows Virtual Desktop without you or your customer having M365 license, technically it will work, but with respect to licenses, you are not, how do I say, it's like using a server operating system without buying the license for it, right? So it would work, but if an audit is conducted, you would not be able to produce the Windows 10 licenses, which is actually being used in your Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure, right? So you have to be using Microsoft 365, or you can just purchase the Windows 10 license separately. So Windows 10 as a service, as a subscription is also available. You can definitely use that as well. But you have to license your Windows 10 either by M365 or by buying a Windows 10 license separately. So what about data protection for organization data within a Windows 10 on Azure VDI infrastructure? Graham, I'm not sure about what exactly you're trying to understand. If you could just drop me an email with more specifics, I'll be more than happy to answer it offline. In a pool desktop scenario, how do you determine when additional VMs are introduced to an environment? Is there a maximum limit to avoid high bills? That's a good question, Reagan. You do have monitoring options available. You can define, and this option is available both within NoDo and outside NoDo as well. You can define expansion based on certain resource utilization. It can be CPU, it can be concurrent connections, it can be RAM utilization. If you see it going beyond 80%, add additional VMs. If it goes less than 40%, then reduce certain VMs, right? These automation options are available. NoDo makes it just simpler because you don't need to script them. These options are just available using the user interface, so you can just select how do you want to auto scale. Now, auto scale doesn't always mean increase, it also means increase and decrease. If you're using Mac, how does the license work? Now, when you say if you're using Mac, I'm assuming you're using Mac as your own personal desktop. So from your personal desktop, when you access Windows Virtual Desktop, then you need to license your Windows Virtual Desktop. Licensing of your Mac is nowhere connected to Windows Virtual Desktop. I'm just running through all the questions, so I think I've answered all of them. So thank you everybody for taking our time and joining the session, asking great questions. The recording and the slides will be shared with everybody in the upcoming days. If you do have any questions, further questions, feel free to drop me an email and I'll be more than happy to jump on a call, schedule a call and answer any of your questions. So thank you very much for your time and patience. Hope it was helpful and informative. As I said, feel free to get in touch with me for any questions. Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies, and have a nice day ahead.